Welcome to Deleted Saves. On this episode, Creatures of the Night, a retrospective review of the Castlevania series. The Castlevania series has long been a staple in my gaming life, from the early days of the NES all the way into the Xbox 360, where I played the last new title in the series. I've hardly played every possible game along the way, but I have hit enough of the important titles to be able to have an overview of where the series began and where it has ended. I've already covered several of the major titles on their own in the earlier seasons of Deleted Saves. Now, I will briefly cover the rest of the series I have played. Starting with 1989's Castlevania III Dracula's Curse, we saw the main character shift from protagonist Simon Belmont to his grandfather Trevor. This game introduced the concept of branching paths in the series and the allies Trevor would gather along the way. Pirate Grant Dynasty, Sorceress Sypha Belnuttis, and Dracula's own half-mortal son Alucard. But you could only have one at a time, and each playthrough with one of these characters locked you out of the others or their branching paths. Outside of Simon's own quests, this game probably had the biggest impact to the overall lore of the series and established that the Belmonts were not alone in their quest to rid the world of the evils of Dracula, nor had Simon actually been successful had the Return of Dracula is more of an insidious curse, one that happens every 100 years like clockwork, and a Belmont must be ready to wage war when the inevitable happens. This game was also hard. A much younger me had a lot of trouble getting anywhere in this game, to the point I was not even enjoying my time with the sequel. It took me a few years of replaying this game to even get to the part where I could recruit Alucard if I wanted. But by the time I made it inside the actual castle section of the game, I was usually out of continues and lives. I threw in the towel after a while with this one, thoroughly defeated by the game, and it's one I'm not likely to revisit, even now. Also in 1989, I played Castlevania The Adventure on the Game Boy, which my dad had bought to keep himself and me entertained on business trips and family vacations, both of which meant long flight times and layovers in airports. What can I say? My dad did a lot of international business travel, and I got brought along. I got this game as an ask, as he wanted a copy of Tetris, and I got this one. In retrospect, a mistake compared to what else is on the Game Boy library. In this game, you take on the role of another of the Belmont family, another of Simon's ancestors named Christopher, on his quest to rescue his son and defeat Dracula. This game is 4 stages long and all of them suck. Not just because of the limitations of the hardware, but because this whole game was a little more than a token throwaway title on the platform. Controlling it was difficult, the jank was on full display, the graphics were shit, and forget the music selection. For a series known for its iconic music scores, this game sounded like a tin whistle stuck up a hobo's ass. Overall, it was highly disappointing. And even as a kid, it was one of those games that made me realize I'd made a very bad purchase. In the last few months in cleaning out my dad's estate, I actually found that old Game Boy. He'd kept it, as he'd kept so much old technology, and all the games we had for it, except Castlevania the Adventure was not among them. Yes, that game was so bad it even decided to disappear from the tiny Game Boy collection a man who hoarded old VCRs and 8-track players had. That's damn telling, if you ask me. Next on the list for me would be 1995's Castlevania Dracula X, a remaster of sorts of the 1993, at the time, Japan exclusive Rondo of Blood for the Super Nintendo. Man, if I'd thought Castlevania 3 was hard, this game beat me into the dirt and left me for dead. While still a remaster, this is the title that introduced Richter Belmont to the world, who would become a classic character in the Konami lineup and who would appear later in the much-beloved Symphony of the Night. While I did enjoy my time with Dracula X, I never really got past the 3rd stage. You may be asking yourself, wait a minute, This guy has talked about a shitload of Dark Souls titles and he beat them. What was so hard about the Castlevania series? I don't know, man. As much as I love these games, I had a huge problem completing so many of them, and I really didn't start beating them with any regularity until the PlayStation era of games. Hell, I didn't even know that there was a whole plot line where you could rescue Richter's girlfriend and her young sister until I read about it in gaming magazines. That's how bad I was at this game. And yet, it and its original are classics in the series. But for me, the castle gates got shut, and I got left out in the cold pretty quick. Can't win them all, I guess. And as Castlevania was showing me, you didn't actually have to be good at video games to enjoy them. Next in the order would be 1999's Castlevania 64 on the N64. And holy hot fuck, getting through this one was a goddamn slog. I'm not really sure I even enjoyed my time with this one. I just spent good money on it in the N64, and I was determined to get my money's worth. What made this title worse wasn't the absolutely broken leap to 3D graphics that made platforming jumps a nightmare that could send you back entire stages, the hunt for white save crystals dotted around at irregular intervals, the fucking bananas plot about Dracula being reborn in the shell of a little kid a la The Omen, the witch cult, the day-night cycle that would affect castle paths, or which NPCs you would have to meet and may not be able to complete the game without meeting. No. It was the fact that this game was composed of fucking cut content. Fully half of the original title was missing. Just a focus of a wet noodle of a protagonist named Reinhard Schneider, the unlucky bastard who had the sad duty of being the Belmont when Dracula arose again in the late 1700s. And the second protagonist, Carrie Fernandez, a child character who was supposedly related to Sypha Belnades from Castlevania 3, like that matters. I'm not a fan of child protagonists in games, but at least her homing magic bullets were more useful than Reinhardt's limp and often flailing whip snaps. Later that year, the whole game would be released as Castlevania Legacy of Darkness, which included the prequel character Cornell the Werewolf and added the character of Henry, a Knight of the Cross using a revolver and tasked with rescuing the other kids Dracula's minions kidnapped that weren't going to be worthy of being the vessel of the Lord of Darkness himself. I reviewed that game separately, and even with all the content, it didn't get much better. Overall, Castlevania 64 was a wet fart of a title, and at the time I didn't think it could get much worse. Oh, how wrong I was. Smash cut to the PlayStation 2 years and 2003's Castlevania Lament of Innocence. By now, every team working for every development studio had figured out how 3D environments and character interactions worked within them. But what they had failed to teach was how not to make them bland and toothless. In the timeline of Castlevania games, this one technically takes place before the last, by this point, nearly 20 years of the series, in which you play the first of the Belmont line, Leon Belmont, who always struck me as a thin attempt to capitalize on Leon S. Kennedy from the Resident Evil 2 game from a few years earlier, as Leon steps into Dracula's castle in the year 1094. In this game, the central area of the castle is a hub world from which Leon departs to separate areas of the game to defeat each area boss, and his Whip of Alchemy as he gains the abilities to use fire, ice, lightning, and all sorts of goodies, with which he will defeat the castle's host of grab bag classic monsters from myth and cinema. Towards the end of the game, the whip transmogrifies into the famed vampire killer, and Leon is the first to defeat Dracula and in return start the long history of the Curse of Dracula revival every 100 years, and a Belmont being there to defeat him. Upon completing the game, 2 new playable characters are unlocked. A rebellious vampire named Joachim, who uses flying swords, and a joke character called Pumpkin, who is a scarecrow with a pumpkin head and a whip. Yes, I played all 3. Yes, all 3 sucked. But at least the whip physics of the game and the gameplay quality had improved over Castlevania 64. What had not improved was the clown show plot, which was somehow worse than all the previous ones. and the just overall bland and lifeless nature of the game. And if your game about vampires is more lifeless than the villains of the piece, then goddamn, you have already lost. While this game still had Koji Igarashi at the helm, along with much of his successful Symphony of the Night team, it was becoming obvious that Konami began to give less and less of a shit about their flagship titles, just to have something to put out. Critics were mixed on this title, seeing it as a bold move towards 3D from 2D games in the series, but the repetitive play was a downgrade. The game even got referenced in a scholarly journal about religion in its games. But I'm pretty sold on the idea that this, at least for me, was a bad game, even though I played it enough to try out the unlockable characters. Sorry, Konami, but you lost me on this one. But of course, I would double down on that. We have 2005's Castlevania Curse of Darkness, in which, for one of the few times at this point, you did not play a Belmont as the central character. Instead, you play as a character named Hector, one of Dracula's two Forge Masters, or the ones who make all of his unique toys and arm his evil armies. The game takes place 3 years after Castlevania 3, and despite his defeat, Dracula's curse still ravages the Transylvanian countryside. Hector has become disquiet, however, no longer believing his place working for supreme evil is the right idea. This runs afoul of his fellow Forge Master, Isaac, and the two get into a fight, and Hector's fiancée gets burned at the stake for witchcraft due to Isaac's meddling, and Hector loses. Deciding to stop Isaac in his evil rise to power, Hector sets out to regain his powers to defeat his co-worker, as only this goth version of Office Space could possibly play out. Along the way, he meets a young witch named Julia, Zede the Holy Man, Trevor Belmont himself, and the character of Saint Germain, who is mysterious for mystery's sake. You can be sure that there are Saturday morning cartoon double crosses afoot as Hector storms Dracula's new castle, again, and sets out to defeat Isaac, who, surprise, surprise, is possessed by Dracula's evil spirit, and Hector must kill him to lift the curse. While I could argue I had a better time with this one than I did Lament of Innocence, I could still see the writing on the wall here as to what direction the Castlevania series was headed as the console generations evolved, and it wasn't great. Too much nonsense in an already nonsense game. Too much fucking with the bastardized timeline to try and fit all these stories in. Too much fluff and filigree goth horse shit. Too much trying to be edgy, and by this point in my gaming life, I had had too many better options for games on the PlayStation 2 than what this game offered. I completed it, but it didn't really stick with me. It was a game. I had Castlevania on the box and the cover, but it was, for all intents and purposes, a Devil May Cry clone. And like the Devil May Cry 2 level of clone. But ultimately, the nadir of my time with this series comes with the last chronological entry in the series I played, Castlevania Lords of Shadow in 2010. Featuring voice work from Sir Patrick Stewart, who was really making the rounds in video game voice acting for a while, and not even hiding its God of War gameplay influences, I wasn't really excited for this title when it came out. But a friend at the time who was also a big fan of the series convinced me to try it out. There were lots of hands in this title, and none of them were Igarashi by this point. In fact, it was only produced by Konami, not actually developed. It was developed by Mercury Steam, a Spanish developer. The most significant members of the team were the director Enrique Alvarez, and of all people, Hideo Kojima, who guided this title to its completion, among others. But very few of them having anything to do with the history of the series, other than as fans and Konami employees half a world away. In this title, you play Gabriel Belmont, unrelated to the previous lineage of Belmonts, who is sent to the Lake of Oblivion by the Church to investigate why all this pesky evil is leaking out and threatening to balance between the Lords of Shadow and the Brotherhood of Light, for which Gabriel works. But it isn't just the Church. Gabriel's dead wife Maria is also telling him to go there because the spirit world is in flux, and it is the end of days in 1047. One of the co-producers, David Cox, said the game is a reboot of the franchise, but we already had this with Castlevania Lament of Innocence, so why would we need a second reboot 7 years apart is just fucking baffling. But none of this game is about Dracula and his castle full of universal monsters. The game, in short, is about a necromancer named Zobek who has searched hell for more power and is shocked, I say, when Satan lies to him and takes over his mind so that Satan can have revenge on God and re-enter heaven. And Gabriel has to stop them. When I say God of War influence, those aren't even my words. Many critics at the time pointed out that Lords of Shadow plays very much in both mechanics and action sequences, much like the first 3 God of War games. And having played at least the first 2 games in that series, I have to say they were right. So Gabriel manages to defeat Satan with the power of his dead wife's soul attached to his trademark whip, but is, along the way, able to damn himself for all eternity and is no longer allowed to enter heaven. After the credits roll, we get a cutscene where it is some time later and Zobek returns to the castle to see a withered, wizened Gabriel Belmont sitting upon his cursed throne, now a vampire calling himself Dracula, who is sad and mopey and who wants to be released from his unlife. And after a brief but tense conversation, Gabriel bursts forth from a massive stained glass window only to land among cars and neon lights and citizens of a modern city. Critics highly praise this title, because who knows why? Stockholm Syndrome, I guess. But the reality was this game sold barely over 1 million units and the players were not convinced, which for a modern Xbox 360 title with a pedigree like this, that was poor. But Konami said it was satisfied with that for the size of the development team and the age of the series. So fuck all of us, I guess. Personally, I completed the title, but I was very disappointed in the final result. Lords of Shadow did not feel like Castlevania. It felt like yet another derivative action title of better titles that had come out since Curse of Darkness. But in the plays of the blasphemous titles, I better understood the artistic directions of the setting, and with the Kojima influence I understood the faux Metal Gear Solid scripting. Yet none of that led to a good or exciting title. It led to a title where I decided to tap out of the series as it was heading in the direction it was. As an odd appendix to this series, Konami has been re-releasing their Castlevania titles in massive bundles across all platforms, both major console titles and their Game Boy Advance titles. So I will, when time allows it, get to play games like Circle of the Moon and Aria of Sorrow. Titles that followed along the path of Symphony of the Night, and that Igarashi, the de facto Castlevania guy during the middle of its life cycle, had a hand in. But the one game I did get to play along after Lords of Shadow was 1994's Castlevania Bloodlines, the only game released for the Sega Genesis with the Castlevania pedigree. This game follows more or less as a direct sequel to Bram Stoker's original Dracula novel, with the main character of John Morris, son of the American cowboy character in the novel Quincy Morris, having to adopt the mantle of vampire killer. The Morrises, it turns out in this universe, are distant relatives of the Belmont clan and the holders of the vampire killer whip. And he and his ally Eric Lecard must hunt down a woman named Elizabeth Bartley, who may have had a hand in starting World War I. And as Europe devolves into more bloodshed and darkness, Bartley, herself recently resurrected by a witch under her enslavement, is seeking to bring Dracula back to rule the world. The heroes hunt her down, despite successfully bringing back the Prince of Darkness, and Morris and Lecard defeat Bartley and Dracula, keeping the world safe from evil for just a little while longer. As I played this in the wake of Lords of Shadow, I realized what I was missing about the Castlevania series as it had progressed to keep up with the times. The tough 2D platforming side-scrolling, the feeling of anything can happen truly wild, monster mashups being flung at the player in great fistfuls, the seemingly better use of technology over 3D environments that were unique to itself rather than derivative of other media. Yes, maybe that is an old nostalgic feeling, but it seems the better answer. This game did review well in its time, but it got lost on the Genesis, which was really not the best platform for this title. Castlevania in the early 90s was still seen as a Nintendo title, and the people playing on the Genesis were not looking for Nintendo titles. Super Castlevania 4, which had come out 3 years earlier, beat the pants off of Bloodlines in looks and gameplay feel. But I do think that Bloodlines really did get lost in the noise to its own detriment. At least we can play it in its modern day again and evaluate it on its own merits now. So where does this put me, and us collectively, on the Castlevania series in 2024? As much as I would like to say it is otherwise, as of the time of this recording, this is another of Konami's dead IP franchises. Konami, for over a decade, decided to put all of their funding into their pachinko machine empire and derivative licensure bits and pieces of their IPs to a grab bag of pop culture shit, mostly for a quick buck. Only within the last 2 or 3 years have they remembered that they make video games, and I think they successfully tested the waters with Bloober Team remaking Silent Hill 2. Despite my misgivings on that original title and my thoughts on what Konami did wrong with that separate series, I have nothing against this remake or its success, but make no mistake. This was to test and see if the public was still willing to accept Konami as a developer and publisher. Who knows? Maybe we'll get a new Castlevania title in the next few years. But will it see the strength, the uniqueness it had before? No, I don't believe so. There are other games about vampires and vampire hunting that have come along since that have sort of laid bare the inconsistencies and failures of that formula. Series like Blood Omen or Soul Reaver, or Vampire the Masquerade and their kin. Invariably, somebody would press to make the whip-wielding Belmont descendants into a third-person over-the-shoulder camera similar to Resident Evil 4. And while Castlevania has horror elements, it's not really a scary or horror game. It is an action game where you defeat monsters in snappy, quick succession. Or even if they made it into a Gears of War or God of War 2018 title, might still not do well for the series, despite how successful those action titles were. I don't have a solution here. I love this series, but it has had just as many misses as hits in its now nearly 40-year history, which one would expect. But it's been working against the series for a long time. Notice how only the best of the series are being used to inform and inspire the successors and clones? I don't know if Castlevania has a place in the modern gaming landscape, and maybe it shouldn't have one as things are going. The re-releases are classic titles, and the more little-known games are great for game preservation and for players old and new to experience the series in its glory days, for good and for ill. Some big names were attached to this series and made their mark based on the series, as would be expected over such a long time. But hey, all things pass given time, even the Prince of Darkness. However, the legacy of this series is splashed all over the gaming landscape. If you are missing that Castlevania feel, like I am, especially when all I really want is another very good Castlevania game, well, the good news is that you have plenty of options. First of all, you could play both of the Blasphemous titles, which are very Symphony of the Night in structure. There is also Bloodstained Curse of the Moon, which is related to the series Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Curse of the Moon carries big Castlevania III Dracula's Curse energy, but in a good and less frustrating way than that original title. There is also Infernax, which I have reviewed before, which is a very good interpretation of Castlevania II Simon's Quest, in everything but name, but it is well worth your time. In addition, Dead Cells Return to Castlevania adds some of the best bits of Symphony of the Night to this unrelated roguelike. And speaking of that, recently the game Vampire Survivors added an Ode to Castlevania DLC to their 30-minute a clip gambling light dirt cheap Castlevania-like original game. Vampire Survivors was never really on my radar before, but now I guess I'm going to be buying Vampire Survivors just to get this DLC. Yeah, I know, silly, but it is true. But these aren't the only games that have those elements of some of the best of the Castlevania series. But all these titles are brought to you from independent studios, not Konami itself. As usual, when there is a market for that, and that market is being underserved, the indie developers have to serve it. And if that's the only way I can get my fix, then so be it. But if we do get another mainline Castlevania game, Konami, I implore you, please stop being such bags of shit and do it right. You need to put Bloober back on this and make a remake of the first 3 games in one title? Fucking go for it. They've proved they can do remakes very well. Just get your shit together and sort out your lives. And please don't give us another Lords of Shadow. We already had 2 and nobody wanted the ones you gave us. Thank you for listening. Deleted Saves would like to thank Brad, Keith Gasper, Orden Wells, and Mass Llama for being patrons of the show. If you would like to become a patron of the show, please go to patreon.com and check out Deleted Saves podcast. All donations go directly towards maintaining the show itself. Thank you.